I saw a video by Hikaru Nakamura, I'll put in the description, of some guy shocking him with the Grob opening, which is, I guess, G4. I liked the way his bishop was active, and I decided to try it on the other side as white. So I started out with B4. He starts out with D5. I follow up with A3, E5, which is good for me. Now it gives me more reason to put my bishop up on C2. It's targeting his pawn in the middle. He defends it with his bishop, developing his king side. I decide to get right into it and start attacking that pawn. That way my bishop will be free later in the game. He pushes the pawn up, so my bishop's locked out. So I push my pawn up too. That way I can get my F bishop out. So he follows up, developing his knight. It looks pretty textbook. I don't know what more to say. Now that my bishop's opened up, I go for a check. My idea here is that if he pushes his pawn up, I'm going to move my bishop back to A4. In the future, I have that diagonal backwards. I can use that space, like D1, to bring my bishop out in the future to the right side. He ends up moving his bishop out, so I decide just trade bishops. So he moves his knight, I move my knight. He moves his knight. I guess I move my rook, considering that pawn hasn't been developed yet, and maybe I'll push that up and open up that file in the future. So he brings his knight in. I think we trade knights, yeah. I think one big mistake was moving that knight from B6 to C4, because I can trade knights. If he takes back with his pawn, that's just another square that his knight can't go to, and he only has one knight now. And it's about, yeah, right here. I develop my knight. He develops, or he pushes his knight up to take more control over the middle. Basically what I decide here is I'm going to use this corner as like my king's like safe space. If I push that pawn up right there, I have a very solid defense. His pawns are blocking the white squares that his knight might like to be at in the future. So I decide to use his over-pushed pawns to my advantage, to my defense. He pushes his pawn up. Seems like a dumb move. I don't see the point of it. Basically, at this point, I'm looking at my F, G, and H pawns, and I want to move. I want to start pushing the right side. The only thing that I don't want to move is my F pawn, because it's still defending the E pawn. So I start with my pawn to G4, and I don't have any reason why I did G instead of H. I just thought it looked better, and I didn't know why. This is my rating showing here. Like, I just pushed it up. So he moves his knight over to attack my pawn. So I move my pawn up one more to attack his knight back. He goes to G4. It's at this point that his knight is kind of trapped. He can't go anywhere, yeah, at all. If he goes anywhere from here, his knight is in danger, so I attack his knight. Not noticing that my pawn is just undefended. I didn't do it on purpose, but I did give him a poison pawn. So he defends his knight with his queen. If I pushed my pawn up to attack his queen, my rook defends the pawn, but he could just move his queen over to F5 or H5. And his knight is still defended. So I decide to attack the knight instead, realizing that he has to move his knight, and then I can take his queen out. For that reason, his knight is now trapped. So he's doing damage control, or I guess what he thinks is the next best move. I don't really know if it is or not. I just take his knight with my pawn. He takes back. I'm a little bit worried about my F and E pawns. So I move my queen up, and I think the idea is that I want to get it off of my first rank. That way I can move a rook behind it in the future. He moves his rook down, and he's attacking the pawns, exactly what I feared. I really didn't know if I could get out of this. Right here, I move my rook to basically X-ray defend the pawn. My knight is in front of my rook, but the pawn is in front of the knight. So if I move my knight, I defend the pawn with my rook. He moves his other rook out. Doesn't concern me at all. I still have everything defended pretty well. I move my bishop back, doing the same kind of thing that I did with the rook and the knight. All I have to do is move my king, and my bishop defends that pawn. I can see my f-pawn dropping in the future. That's what I think is going to happen. At this point, he could take that pawn with his rook, and that's what he did. So I guess I just moved my queen out of the way. Moves his other rook down, attacking that pawn. I just moved my king down. Now the pawn is defended. My knight is defended. At this point, I think he should have put his queen on the f-file. He just ends up pushing his pawn twice. And I think pushing that pawn twice, I think it wasted tempo. Like, because he moved that pawn, I was able to move my rook up for one. Pushes it up again. I can't really do stuff on the h-file with the bishop and the pawn there. So I decided to just simplify a little bit. I'm up a piece. I'll take his rook. He'll take my rook. I move my knight up, and it's defended by the pawn. I figure I'll just trade some more pieces. At this point, the pawn is defended by the bishop and the rook. So he takes with his bishop. I take back with my pawn. And if it weren't for my bishop here, my dark square bishop, I might have lost this game. It's actually really nice that he was blocked in my king's safe space, defending the corners, because it's at this point that my bishop defends my now f-pawn. So he moves his queen up, and his idea is pretty easy. It's to move his rook over to d3. So I move my bishop up to defend that. He moves his rook down, and that does not work, as you'll see. And then at this point, it's basically just getting rid of all of his pieces, trying to promote mine. Move my bishop back to attack his queen. He can push the pawn up, and then I can just take it with my queen. He has to move his queen. I offer a trade. He wants to gobble up pawns. That was a bad move, just because I moved my queen to a spot with a lot of opportunity. There's also a pawn that I can take at b5. He just has a bunch of undefended pawns that I can attack. So he pushes his pawn up. I take his other pawn. He moves his queen down for a check. I'm really not concerned at this point because his pawn at c4 is vulnerable. And if I take that out, I can move my queen down to help defend my king from that pawn promoting on the e rank. So I just pushed my king over. I decided to go that way because his queen is on white squares. On dark squares, the queen can't access my king. He can't check me any more ways. It's at this time that I can counterattack. Now I'm trying to get him to move his king back to h6. That way I can take that pawn on the e thing. He doesn't. My bishop is defended now. He has no way to promote his pawn. He moves his queen up. I think a last-ditch effort. He can't beat me if I have a bishop. It just doesn't work that way. So we trade queens. I start pushing my pawns up. His king can't do anything to defend this. It's at this point he resigns. So looking at the analysis, my accuracy was 90.4. 90.4 is good. Like, I think that's really good. It's impressive to me, but even so, he was winning for the majority of the game. He had me down in a position where I really couldn't stop his pawn from promoting, and if it wasn't for his rating, he probably would have won. So it was an interesting game. I would recommend it. d4, e4 openings are boring, especially if you're a lower rating. You can use common sense and open up really any way you want. You know, someone's going to make a mistake if you're a lower rating.